Namaste and greetings. I, Fiza Mahajan, visiting researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान नई दिल्ली, extend a warm welcome to you all for joining us today for Day 7 of the Feminist Foreign Policy Fellowship, an online international winter school program. This 3-month Immersive Leadership Certificate Training Fellowship is proudly brought to you by the IMPRI Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies and IMPRI Gender Impact Studies Center in collaboration with the Asia Foundation. Our chair for this program is Professor Vibhuti Patel ji, hello ma'am, visiting distinguished professor at IMPRI and former professor at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. We are grateful for her continued guidance and leadership. The experts for today are Ms. Vedya Nainar, independent researcher at Gender and Human Rights Consultant, and Professor Asha Hans, founder director at School of Women's Study at Utkal University, India. We will share video recordings of each session to support flexible learning at your convenience. The guidelines document will be emailed to you after the session for your perusal. And again, before we start today's session, I would like to announce the housekeeping rules once again. It is imperative that you join the meeting on time. There will be a Q&A session after each presentation. Share your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. The questions must not be posted as an anonymous attendee. Ensure that your questions are precise and refrain from making general comments and questions to save time. Now I would request Professor Vibhuti Patel to start the session with her opening remarks. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, welcome Dr. Vahida Nainar and Professor Asha Hans to the 7th day of Feminist Foreign Policy Fellowship, and also welcome esteemed participants from all several countries, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So this, first of all, we would like to thank both Asia Foundation and IMPRI's team, so Ms. Nandita Barua, Ms. Apurva Singh, Dr. Arjun Kumar, Dr. Simi Mehta, and the coordinators, Mr. Satyam, Mr. Sivitita, Ms. Sweta, and today's moderator, Fiza Mahajan. The brief recap of what all has transpired in last 6 days is important. Dr. Simi Mehta provided profile of previous 2 courses, extremely successful feminist foreign policy courses, where we had more than 800 participants. For this course, we got 1,100 applications, and that's why we are also putting the proceedings in the public domain, because fellows are only around 90. So Ms. Nandita Barua, in her right opening remark, she spoke about the importance of diversity, equity, national security, foreign policy, securitization, and the intersectional perspective, and shifting the attention of feminist foreign policy to the global south. We also had, like, I gave a profile of the genesis of transnational feminist solidarity, 1980 onwards, by Nairobi Forward-Looking Strategy Convention of Population and Development, and also the impact of stabilization policies of the 80s and 90s and neoliberal globalization, how it increased the human misery. And it is in this context that we need to situate the wars which were earlier going on in the 200 places. Currently, officially, it is said that at 48 geographical locations, conflicts and wars are happening. And so peacemaking, peace building, peacekeeping becomes a very important humanitarian agenda. We had a keynote address by Ms. Stephenie Foster, who talked about the 4 constructs gender with regard to feminist foreign policy, namely gender equality, broadening the definition of security from national security to human security, elevation of diverse voices and addressing historic power imbalances, and pitching our intervention strategy for feminist foreign policy from that point of view. On day 2, we had Dr. Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharya, who spoke on origin and trajectory in theories and practice, and she also critically reflected on various international relations theory which are in the mainstream, whether it was a question of the realism or constructivism or post-colonial theorization. And she also talked about the critical and normative perspective, like feminism, which got traction in as a result of CEDAW and NFLS and Beijing Platform for Action and United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, and Millennium Development Goals as well as Sustainable Development Goals. We had a very interesting discussion after that by Dr. Keshav Giri, who talked about international relations and Eurocentrism, and he also quoted theories of John Hobson, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, Edward Said on Orientalism, and he also talked about that the some of the very empowering experiences of the global South and where the women have played a very important role. For example, Srimati Yog Mata in Nepal, or Dr. Hansa Mehta, who contributed to the and expanded the horizons of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was earlier considered to be only men's rights, no? And Ms. Sharifa Hamid Ali, who was also the first member of the 1946 Status of Women's Commission, and also AIWC's president in 1935. And he also said that we need to focus on this empowering experiences of feminism and decolonize feminist future, enshrines, promotes, and protects human rights of all, and seeks to disrupt colonial, racist, patriarchal, male-dominated power structures, and allocates significant resources, including research, to achieve this vision. On day 3, we had a presentation on intersectionality and gender mainstreaming in Global South. Intersectionality has been continuous thread from day 1 by all the scholars and experts on this subject. On day 4, we had a presentation by Professor Anuradha Chenoy, who spoke on women in war, peace, and security, and she shared her personal involvement in terms of working with the war-affected people. She also gives so many examples of the domestic conflict situation, where she talked about the story of Kargil, and she also talked about stories in Jharkhand by the Maoist liberation. This thing in South Asia, she gave examples of Nepal and Sri Lanka, and she also talked about the her first-hand experiences in Buxar district of Bihar and in Assam, and she gave a very poignant narration of women's lives in the camps, refugee camps, and their vulnerabilities, multiple marginalities and vulnerabilities. And she also said that NATO or national security officials such as Condoleezza Rice of USA under President Bush's regime, she had responded that she had justified and rationalized 40,000 children in Iraq being killed. So just by being a biologically woman, you just don't become a person who would further feminist agenda of distributive justice, gender justice, and social justice. We had a very powerful presentation by Professor Mariam Siddharth Khan from South Africa, who spoke on global migration and feminist foreign policy, and she gave so many examples of African countries which are fighting against racism, slavery, apartheid, and the economic exploitation of Africa. And she also said that we should not allow the bootlickers of capitalist patriarchy and the queen bees women in the international relations, and those who further feminist foreign policy should have credentials of working for the marginalized section at a ground level. Professor Manisha Madhav's rigorous analysis as a political scientist was captured in a presentation, Engendering National Security, a critical alternative to militarized security frameworks. And she said that how the machismo or the hypermasculinity was defining the international relations, and women also who get their recognition in that mainstream diplomacy, they also are they proudly say that we are like man, and that is really problematic. And she gave many examples, and Professor Janki Andaria also mentioned Novella. She is a Jolly Good Fellow by Srijita Nair. And on day 5, we had Miss Rita Manchanda, who spoke on gender, refugee, and politics of feminization of refugee subject. And she gave a very important insights of what's currently happening in Manipur and what is happening to Rohingya refugees in our country and in Bangladesh. And she also said that whole depoliticization of women refugees is misleading. They have their agency and they should have a voice and decision-making power and representation in all the negotiations regarding conflict and peace. And then on day 6, we had Dr. Athika Noor Alami from Indonesia, who spoke on feminist foreign policies, ideology, semantics, and global south. And she also said that we must join conversations to bring meaningful changes in the content of feminist foreign policy, which is currently so dominated by global north. And we should get the voices of global south, though we know that internally, domestically, we have strong patriarchal bias and the aversion to anything feminism, but dialogue must continue. Then Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharya's second lecture was very comprehensive and historically rooted, where she talked about the feminist foreign policy and the UN agencies, and she gave the role and the contribution or limitations of the UN agencies. She spoke about the feminist agenda furthered by International Labour Organization, World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, UN Instro, UNICEF, UNESCO, UNHRC, UNIFEM, and UN Women. And after that, we had a very interesting discussion about what is UN effective in current context. Has it really taken a principled stand, or it is just acting like a teddy bear? No? Thank you. And over to today's experts and IMPRI team. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the recapitulation. Now I am honored to call upon our first expert, Ms. Vahida Nainar, independent researcher and gender and human rights consultant, and she will address us on the topic of feminist foreign policy, theory and practice. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, Vibhuti. Thank you, Fiza, for having me. Somehow my connection works best if there is no video. Yeah. But so I will keep my video short, but I'm going to share my PPT just now. Just 1 second. Oh, 1 second. One moment. Yes. I will. Is that visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
All right. Thank you very much. It's really an honor for me to be present here again in yet another IMPRI, impactful IMPRI session on feminist foreign policy. Ideally, it would have been better if the topic was addressed at the beginning, but I was unfortunately not available. So I will be talking on feminist foreign policy theory and practice, and I understand our Indonesian faculty person has addressed part of it. But nevertheless, here we are, feminist foreign policy theory and practice theory as in the contents of the existing foreign policy and its practice, or so broad in talking in broad strokes. So for today's session, we will be talking about foreign policy in general, which I'm sure the course has already looked into, but just to serve as a background, a little background of it, we'll talk about foreign policy and what makes this foreign policy feminist. What are the emerging understandings of the feminist foreign policy, particularly coming from the feminist foreign policies that are already in place, and some of the earliest one like Sweden, France, Mexico, Canada, and others. We talk about the contents of these feminist foreign policy and assess briefly from a feminist lens or from the emerging understandings of feminist foreign policy. What is how is the practice of these countries that have adopted feminist foreign policy, the extent to which they are incongruous with their own stated feminist foreign policy, and what is the fallout of that, and whether any kind of inconsistencies that we see in feminist foreign policy, do they have an opportunity for advancement of gender equality, and then we draw some conclusion out of it. So here we talk about, so what is features of foreign policy to begin with. Foreign policy, as we know, is a mechanism that national governments use to guide their diplomatic interactions and relations with other countries. It's a state's foreign policy reflects its values, goals, and helps drive its political, economic aims in global arena. Many foreign policy have a focus on national international security, and it also determine how it will interact with other international organizations like the United Nations and citizens of other countries. So foreign policies challenges, promote stability, protect shared interests. A nation's foreign policy typically works in similar policy that is applied domestically. It is often influenced by a country's geographical, financial, political circumstances, behavior of other foreign policies of other country, and the state of international order, whether it is in a state of war or unrest, trade alliances to consider, etc. Typically, of course, a foreign policy covers issues such as national interest, peace and security, human rights, equality, dignity, dignity in particularly talks about trade and humanitarian agencies, etc. It talks about trans-border issues that enhance people-to-people interaction. It often talks about exchanges between different groups of people in different countries, youth, women, student professionals, bureaucrats, business persons, sports person, etc. And also includes issues of health and climate change or natural disasters caused by climate change, green gas emissions, etc. These are broadly the issues of that covers foreign policy that comes under the broad category, of course, of development assistance, and then diplomacy, trade, economic, and technological advances. So what makes this foreign policy, which is conventional foreign policy, feminist? Is it adding women's rights to it? Is it adding gender equality to it, or adding feminism and to a conventional foreign policy? So what is it? Is it adding all of the three, or one of it and stirring that makes a foreign policy feminist? So let's look at this from existing foreign policies and feminist foreign policies to discuss the emerging understandings of feminist foreign policy. So as you know, some of the earliest foreign policies is by Sweden, Canada, France, Mexico, etc. Just to pick out some of the what these countries mean when they say they have adopted feminist foreign policy. For Canada, feminist foreign policy is something that applies a feminist lens to all aspects of Canada's international engagement. Then the International Center for Research on Women, it summarized an understanding of feminist foreign policy, based on all the existing foreign policies that were there until 2018, and said that the policy, feminist foreign policy, is a policy of a sovereign state in its interaction with other sovereign states based on the theory of political, economic, and social equality of sexes, delivered to advance women's rights and interest. So that is as per, a summary of what different states that have adopted feminist foreign policy, state or understand a feminist foreign policy. Among the most comprehensive one is by Thompson, Patel, Kripke, O'Donnell, which states that feminist foreign policy is a policy of a state that defines its interaction with other states, as well as movements and other non-state actors, in a manner that prioritizes peace, gender equality, and environmental integrity, enshrines, promotes, and protects the human rights of all, seeks to disrupt colonial, racist, patriarchal, and male-dominated power structure, and allocate significant resources, including research, to achieve that vision. Feminist foreign policy is coherent in its approach across all of its levers of influence, anchored by the exercise of those values at home and co-created with feminist activist groups and movements at home and abroad. So this is among the most comprehensive one, regardless of the fact that it also still has some limitations, which we'll discuss. And the reason that it is a most comprehensive one is, one, it expands the conventional scope of a state's interaction. This interaction is not only limited to other states, which is how it is conventionally understood, but also includes interaction with movements and other non-state actors. Two, it includes the inclusion of gender equality and human rights as priority. In the absence to priority to these are the issues to be first axed off in the event of resource constraints in issues of security. And additionally, it prioritizes but not limits it only to development assistance, but all aspects of foreign policy when it says that it prioritizes peace, environmental integrity, and gender. Three, it recognizes the need to go beyond prioritizing and put the money where the mouth is. It envisions allocation of significant resources to achieve the visions of feminist foreign policy, in the absence of which, of course, the vision would remain on paper. Four, it is co-created in consultation and participation of feminist activists, groups, and movements working at domestic and international level. This follows the feminist principle of nothing about us without us, as well as enables articulation of policy that is feminist and evaluation of its performance from a feminist lens. Five, it requires that the policy is anchored in similar values domestically at home. So it also emphasizes that this policy is not only to be applicable to populations and peoples out there in other states and other movements and all that, but also it must reflect similar values at home. Finally, and most importantly, it acknowledges that foreign policy is not only about prioritizing, enshrining, protection, and promotion of certain values. Foreign policies must also disrupt, vacate, and challenge existing axes of power structures that threaten domestic and international peace and security. However, the enumeration of the kind of power structure in the understanding of these authors of colonial, racist, patriarchal, and male-dominating, while very important, is limiting, because it omits other power structures that operate in a similar manner in different contexts. For example, the excluded power structures of class, caste, ethnicity, religion, and indigenous location cannot necessarily be subsumed under the listed enumerations of power structure. So these, the power structures could be any power structure that is operating on the ground and contributing to, proliferation of gender inequality and discrimination and marginalization. So this limitation does not fully give effect to the feminist principle of understanding issues from an intersectional standpoint. That is, how different power sectors intersect with each other generally and with gender specifically to create unique situations of deprivation, discrimination, and marginalization. Another limitation is the principle of accountability and transparency. Feminist foreign policies are inherently accountable and transparent, so as to leave scope to course correct when its implementation derails from the policy vision. Now, I want to talk about the foreign the earliest one is Sweden, which is taken here, and key aspects of the content of this feminist foreign policy, which is shown in Sweden Feminist Foreign Policy Handbook, and it was first introduced in 2014. It has a solid ideological foundation for gender equality at home, as well as the full support of political leadership. The foundation has served as sharper tools for pursuing gender equality issues in various forms for dialogue. This policy seeks to advance gender equality for its own sake and in service to other foreign policy priorities. It extends to all domains of foreign policy. It lists that the policy encompasses the 3 R's. Rights, which is recognition and honoring universal human rights and women's rights to promote women's empowerment and eliminate gender-based violence and discrimination. The second R is representation, that is at all levels of decision-making, public, private, domestic, regional, international, and in all systems, social, political, economic, legal, in a manner that goes beyond symbolism and rhetoric. The third R is the resources, which is equitable allocation of and equitable access to all kinds of resources to ensure gender inclusion. And the Swedish ambassador for gender equality and coordinator of feminist foreign policy, Ann Burns, referenced the need for a 4th R in 2018 or so. And that 4th R is reality. That is reality which encourages the Foreign Service to study the context in which they are working and engage with local actors. So this is their version of achieving certain aspects of intersectionality, because when you learn the context in which you're working, the power structures that impede equality and discrimination inevitably emerges. Swedish for feminist foreign policy covers broad 3 domains: foreign national security policies, development cooperation, and a trade and promotional policy. Interestingly, it does not have any accountability framework to track progress and evaluate the implementation of its policy. The next would be the Canada's feminist foreign policy, which is in its document called the Feminist International Assistance Policy. And it prioritizes gender equality in the service of broader economic and security goals. Like Sweden, it is couched in itself in a commitment to rights and allocates budgets and puts resources on the table and embraces a benchmark of committing 95% of its foreign assistance to gender equality as a principal or significant goal. According to the Government of Canada, their policy seeks to eradicate poverty and build a more peaceful, more inclusive, more prosperous world. And this is most promoting gender equality and empowerment of women and girls is the most effective approach to achieving that goal. It broadly includes 6 priority areas, and among the significant of these 6 is what is known as human dignity, which is an umbrella term that includes what you know as development aid or assistance matters, healthcare, nutrition, and timely deliverance of humanitarian assistance, women's political participation, and women's peace and security. Like the first Swedish thing, Canada also does not have an accountability framework in its stated feminist foreign policy. Then if we move on to France's feminist policy, which was the Canada's one was done in 2017 and France was introduced in 2019. And the focus of France's feminist foreign policy is on feminist diplomacy. It articulates a number of gender-related priorities for the French government to address through its foreign assistance. According to the strategy, gender equality is a top priority of the president's mandate. It will be a principal and cross-cutting theme, which will underpin all of France's external actions, and specific measures will be taken to promote it. It has 5 thematic pillars. healthcare for women, girls, broadly speaking, which includes sexual and reproductive health, access to education, including sexuality education, vocational training, employment, raising the legal age of marriage to 18, and infrastructure to enhance access to remote areas. The French policy describes an approach that identifies the priorities according to three principles: comprehensive, rights-based, gender-based, pledging to include gender in all French diplomatic priorities and all political, economic, soft diplomacy, cultural, education, and development cooperation action. France's comprehensive approach is the closest it comes to extending the scope of its policy to apply broadly than to limit it only to and gender it includes accounting and transparency with regular public reporting requirements. And it mandates annual evaluation of the progress against the strategy. Then we move on to a non-European country, which is the Mexico's feminist foreign policy, which is among the first foreign policy from a global South country, was introduced in 2020. And according to, it has 5 main principles. One is integrating a gender perspective and feminist agenda through all aspects of Mexico's foreign policy. Second is achieving gender parity within the foreign ministry and instituting organizational reforms in support of gender equality in the workplace. Third is combating all forms of gender-based violence, including within the foreign ministry. Fourth is ensuring a feminist leadership and women's contribution, particularly from women from indigenous, Afro-descendant, and other historically marginalized group to the development of foreign policy. And lastly, following an intersectional approach in all foreign policy actions. It also clarifies that it will not only engendering the policy in all thematics of the foreign policy, but also address structural issues that maintains gender status quo on these things. So as you would see, Mexico is among the first country that commits to a following intersectional feminist approach in all foreign policy action. And just to move on to some of the other feminist foreign policy before we do a little bit of synthesis of the contents of these feminist foreign policy from a feminist lens. The others would include Spanish, again, another European country, feminist foreign policy, which was introduced in 2021 and has led 5 principles. Among the important ones, the structural reform to change work practices and institutional culture within foreign service, ensuring that a gender perspective is systematically mainstreamed in every action through transformational approach that seeks to ensure coherence across all areas of external action. So to have a gender perspective within the foreign service and to reflect that in every action across all areas of external action. So again, not limiting it only to development aid and assistance. The others would be strengthening participation and alliance building to unite state efforts towards gender equality. This includes reaching consensus on policy with civil society and other stakeholders. So it is talking about participation and consultation with several stakeholders. And like Mexico, the Spanish policy has a focus on intersectionality and diversity as part of its feminist approach to mainstreaming gender in foreign policy. With it encompasses gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, economic status, religious belief, disability, and place of origin. So that's the broad focus of Spain's foreign policy. Luxembourg, the key strength of Luxembourg, it is much later, it's among the policy that has been done much later and it is stated more as a commitment to feminist foreign policy. And the strength of this approach is to embrace feminist foreign policy across all streams of diplomacy, defense, and development. And thematically, Luxembourg's emphasis on women's rights is unique. And also unique is an equal emphasis on the rights of girls, women, and LGBTQI people. There are several others that feminist foreign policy that have been introduced since then, as you other panelists may have already talked about, which is Germany in 2021, Colombia in 2022, Netherlands in 2023. What I'd like to go to next is a commitment to foreign policy from Libya, which is very interesting. Don't necessarily have adopted foreign policy yet, but what they have is stated a commitment, and the articulation of this commitment is very interesting. The Libya's first women foreign policy, Naila Mongoose, announced commitment to feminist foreign policy. And she cited the context of country's security, economic challenges, as well as ongoing struggle as the reason or the basis or the purpose for embracing a feminist foreign policy, which means that she believed that feminist foreign policy has a potential to address some of the challenges that the country is facing. The approach, she said, would be rooted in the Women, Peace and Security agenda that is adopted in the Stabilization Initiative of Libya, which includes issues of combating flow of arms for foreign fighters, countering terrorism, etc., displacement, migration issue, and place people at the center of the decision-making and support a human rights-based approach and rule of law. So that is also says how the policy would be rooted. It also states that the policy would be understanding the perspective of marginalized parties in design of feminist foreign policy and decision-making, improving the standard of living for those communities and upholding human rights, security, dignity, and digital security. And it will encompass all types of reforms, security sector reforms, economic reform, and policy reform. When announcing the foreign minister announced the intention to come up with feminist foreign policy, it stated its understanding, very interesting understanding, which it states feminist foreign policy of what is feminist foreign policy. And this is very interesting for us to have. In fact, for even the understandings in the northern countries to look into and adopt. She says that feminist foreign policy is a complete, consistent, and coherent approach to a body of work encompassing all auspices of foreign policy and international relations. Done right, the approach will include, but not be limited to, aid, defense, and immigration, in addition to diplomacy, using all the tools in the foreign policy toolbox to advance a more equitable world. This means that the feminist foreign policy is not only by women and for women, but goes further, taking a non-binary gendered lens that recognizes and seeks to correct for historical patriarchal and often racist and or neo-colonialist imbalances of power as they play out in the world stage. So it is not a policy that is limited to single aspect of international relations or any single program or initiative. So these are the broad understandings of feminists, which I thought was very interesting. Now, if you look at all these feminist foreign policies, As we can see, it was only Sweden that builds upon the strong gender equality basis at a domestic level, because Sweden is among the only country that ranks very high on global gender equality index. Spain, Mexico, Libya's proposed are the ones that includes participation, the co-creation aspect into feminist foreign policy, and the aspect of consultation with feminists and women's stakeholders. Most of the others feels like, particularly the earlier ones, is an internal exercise of foreign offices, albeit with sometimes or even with the initiation of officials who are feminist individually. It's only France and Mexico that has an accountability framework to evaluate progress. There are, with the exception of Luxembourg, most of the articulation of feminist foreign policies of these countries that have issues of all foreign policy action, and from that one can induce induce that it also includes it includes not only soft women's issue or issues of development aid like education, employment, health issues, humanitarian issues, which are all very important nevertheless, but also that whether they include so-called hard issues of peace, security, militarism, extremism, conflicts, displacement, migration, etc. Only Mexico, Spain, and Libya's proposed commitment has a certain intersectional analysis in framing or articulation of the feminist foreign policy. It is often, most of them, based in focus with gender equality, gender rights, women's empowerment, gender mainstreaming in various aspects or all aspects of development aid. And often it is couched in women, peace, and security agenda, focusing on the three R's. It is, yeah, except I believe for feminists often focus on binary gender, binary focus on women, excluding non-binary stakeholders and communities and their needs. And the exception here is, of course, Luxembourg. So as we can see, not these feminist foreign policies do not necessarily have all the features that makes a foreign policy feminist. But does this omission deprive these policies of their feminist characters? Not necessarily so, because these are for these feminist foreign policies have a potential to serve as a foundation upon which to build a more comprehensive feminist foreign policies, and therefore are a step in the right direction. There are several foreign policy practices of the state that are incongruous with the feminist foreign policy, thereby making it a farce. So we'll move on to say what these practices are. So in Sweden, Canada, and they have simultaneous arms trade with non-democratic government that promote women's human rights abuse. In 2018, Sweden's military exports rose by 2% to non-democratic countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and countries of Philippines, Brazil. So they have come under fire for their arms trade in Saudi Arabia, whose record is, of course, generally on human rights and on women's rights in particular, is poor. But addressing this critique, Sweden did make a legislative change to its arms rules regulation in 2017 to imply that the democratic status of the receiving country shall be central condition for assessing whether or not to grant permission to the arms trade. And yet, despite this legislation, arms sales to Saudi Arabia rose to 2%, as it's already stated. And many of those exports included military exports to non-democratic countries. with extensive human rights record of human rights abuses. Canada made an arms deal with Saudi Arabia, and therefore came under similar criticism following the publication of the Feminist International Assistance Policy. In France too, parliamentarian and feminist alike questioned then President Macron's military support for a dictator in Chad. In Mexico, there is inconsistency with the leadership of, promoting feminist policy and the state of gender relations in the country, generally speaking. The strategy identifies the eradication of gender-based violence as one of its top priorities, but domestic women's rights activists have criticized government inaction and lack of recognition of domestic violence, state violence, and femicide. 11 women are murdered every day, and there is a rise of domestic violence after the pandemic in Mexico. In 2022, President Obrador called domestic violence helpline as receiving fake calls of violence, and that femicide is manipulated by the media. So this was the government talking about the general states of violence in the country on the one hand, while promoting feminist foreign policy on the other hand. So these, in practice, what they do in practice does not sit well with their stated articulated feminist foreign policy. So this, so how does these inconsistencies work? Mexico definitely say that is there an opportunity there? Because subsequent to all the backlash from women's rights activists acknowledged that it is risky to call the policy feminist, and that cooperation foreign policy on egalitarian and inclusive society. So there are documents that say that it will seek on this matter. The government stated intent to use the commitment under Mexico's feminist foreign policy to incorporate and advance international women's human rights standard at home. So, and it is an opportunity in the sense that we'll use the stated feminist foreign policy to advance human rights at home, including through launch of a UN Spotlight initiative on ending gender-based violence. And these are a promising indication of potential change. Then there is a belief that with feminist foreign policy, Mexico is obligated to advance and advocate stronger women's rights regime at home. And some developments after this includes the landmark Supreme Court decision to decriminalize abortion nationwide, which has been a key demand of women's rights groups, and a gender parity in law with equal representation of female congressional leaders. And these are some of the promising domestic action that would hopefully reinforce the trend towards feminist approaches to policy making and implementation in both domestic and foreign policy. And Canada is also working behind the scenes to further build feminist elements to foreign policy. So despite the limitation in the stated foreign policy content of its foreign policy, it is seeking to, behind the scenes, to work, including through a series of sectoral policies, like Canada's trade diversification strategy, which contains an inclusive approach to trade, which is including women and other marginalized communities inclusion. Then there is a second national action plan on women, peace and security, and the appointment of the world's first dedicated ambassador for women, peace and security within Canada's Women, Peace and Security program. Its new defense policy, Strong, Secure, Engage, contains an internal guidance on implementing feminist foreign policy, which was issued to embassies and other governments in early 2019. and a ministerial commitment to feminist foreign policy articulated in a 2021 mandate letter. And during this time, the civil society organization also continued to push for a fully articulated, publicly available policy document spelling out Canada's approach and commitments to the feminist foreign policy. One aspect to note about all these feminist foreign policies is that there are about 16 odd countries that have adopted feminist foreign policies. Most of them are from Europe, Sweden, France, Spain, like Germany, Luxembourg, Netherlands. Among this, only Sweden is high on the Global Gender Equality Index with a long-standing commitment to gender equality. The other countries are still do not rank as high in gender equality index. Nevertheless, Canada and other European countries are known to take pro-gender equality stand in international discussions and negotiation. But the question is, the question still remains, what about the countries like Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Libya that want to adapt the feminist foreign policy? So what makes a country that is not conventionally ranking high in global gender equality index want to adopt a feminist foreign policy? In case of Mexico, Mexico's case seems to be an aspirational one. In that it aspires to a leadership role in the global human rights scene, and showing a commitment to women's rights is one way of doing so. It acknowledges that such international leadership compels progress and advances domestically as well. So in a way, it is that in some countries, a directive or a compulsion coming from its commitment outside would give changes. Another aspect of this introduction of feminist foreign policy, even if it is in the countries of North, is having strong feminists and individuals committed to gender equality as officials in the government, in the foreign ministries, that push, and Libya is a key example of that push for feminist foreign policy in the hope that getting the countries to adopt this feminist foreign policy would in effect compel changes domestically as well. So in many of these countries, the case of Mexico's feminist foreign policy also, because those who are sent to, who interact at various international fora on behalf of the government of Mexico are often feminist, are often, strong gender advocates, and they push for strong policies, which then the Mexico as country, adopts and has to ratify internally. So these are the compulsions of communities in the global South, some of them, as I've stated, and their push for adoption of feminist foreign policy provides them a basis, an advocacy tool domestically to argue for changes at home. So in conclusion, of foreign policy, including militarism, extremism, conflicts, displacement, migration, extra reality of situation it specifically will perpetuate inequality, and discrepancy is something that is co-created with feminists and stakeholders stakeholders in the context with which the policy seeks to interact with and exchange with. And finally, it is also accountable and transparent with mechanism to evaluate progress of the implementation of feminist foreign policy. Thank you. With that, I conclude, and here are some of the references that have been used for this break. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for an inspiring and interesting session, I would say. It was enlightening to learn how countries like Sweden, France, Mexico are integrating feminist principles into diplomacy while also reflecting on the challenges such as the need for border inclusivity and accountability. Thank you so much, ma'am, for an insightful session. Now I would like to invite our chair, Professor Patel, for her remarks.
So thank you, Dr. Vahida Nainar, for giving very important comparative analysis of the status and the challenges to feminist foreign policies in different nation states. I wanted to know whether out of these 16 countries which have adopted feminist foreign policy, do you see something unique about feminist foreign policy of Colombia? Do you think that in terms of political will or commitment or accountability system, Colombia is very different from rest of the countries? No, it's a class apart.
Do we want me to answer it now? You want to take some questions?
Asha, take more questions.
Okay. Sure.
All right, I request the participants
That are already
to raise their hand if they want to ask any question, or they can type in the question in the Q&A box.
Have you given them this to unmute? Can they unmute? Are they given permission?
Priyanka will handle that.
Priyanka?
They can anyway raise the hand if they have a question.
Yeah.
Any comments or question, you can type in or you can raise your hand.
Okay, I think I can continue with Professor Patel's question, and then they can type in their question and can continue answering those.
Yeah.
Sure,
yeah. Okay. All right. So Colombia's feminist policy, which was announced in 2023, it focuses on integrating gender equality into its international relations and development efforts. It's unique in the sense that it builds upon its extensive history of gender, history of conflict, and its gender-attentive policy in transitional justice and peace processes. So their feminist foreign policy has the key features. One is peace and conflict resolution, which has gender-sensitive approaches in peace building, and recognizing the impact, disproportionate impact on women and gender minorities. It prioritizes women's leadership in peace agreements and negotiations. Another key is human rights and gender justice, particularly emphasis on protection of women and other non-binary genders. It supports gender-responsive reparation programs, addressing the harm caused by a long-standing armed conflict. It has, of course, a focus on economic empowerment, particularly access to resources, women-led projects in international cooperation. Again, climate, specific mention of climate and environmental justice, incorporating gender perspectives into these climate action policy, ensuring that marginalized groups are part of environment decision-making. And also it has an emphasis on institutional strengthening, mainstreaming of gender equality across Colombia's diplomatic corps and foreign policy institutions, and increasing the representation of women. So probably this it's notable for being rooted in the history of addressing gender-based inequalities domestically, particularly through reparations and land restitution policies. So this kind of is very specific. The fact that it is rooted in its conflict, it has sort of, made the policy learning from its past conflicts and addressing the needs of the communities that have come out of this conflict, particularly with regard to reparations and land redistribution policy. So that makes this policy pretty unique. Unlike, for example, others' policy. For example, if you compare it with Sweden, its foundation is its strong gender equality. Commitment is the basis for international feminist foreign policy for Sweden, whereas for Colombia, it is quite the opposite. It is rooted in its historic gender inequalities and marginalization of communities that was caught in a long-standing internal conflict situation. Do we have other questions?
Yeah, there are many questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Samu Casey, yeah, she's there.
I request Janki Andharia ji to ask her question.
Yes, thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I just wanted to understand what counts as feminist foreign policy. Is it self-declaration, or is it that it has to have certain elements of, say, feminism, and somebody else sort of says that, yes, this is feminist foreign policy, or
so this is a question from Janki Andharia. Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. What makes, often it is self-declared. So when these countries adopted feminist foreign policy, they stated it as a feminist foreign policy. What makes it feminist foreign policy is certain elements that that it includes, particularly its focus on gender equality, particularly its focus on mainstreaming of gender in all its international actions. That's what makes that's what they believe. So if you have followed my first or third slide, Canada feels that adding a feminist lens to all its interaction is what makes it a feminist policy. Sweden's commitment, long-standing foundation on gender equality, makes it a feminist foreign policy. For France, it is feminist diplomacy, inclusion of feminist diplomacy, what makes it feminist foreign policy. And all of them, all of these have elements of what we would call feminist understanding of issues within them. They are not all necessarily comprehensive, because as I mentioned, I did propose, a show of comprehensive understanding, what I believe was a comprehensive understanding, albeit with limitations, and I address those limitations also. And doesn't seem like any of the foreign policies fully embraces all aspects of that understanding of what ought to be a feminist foreign policy, but that nevertheless does not deprive them of a feminist character within their foreign policy. It certainly serves as a foundation on which to build upon a more comprehensive one. So all these foreign policies, they are stated. Often it is self-declared, but with some basis and elements of feminism within their understanding of their foreign policies.
Thank you so much, ma'am. The next question is from Shobna Karthikeyanji. The question is, when would India become a part of the League of Countries which has embraced foreign policy?
Ma'am, I meant feminist foreign policy. I didn't type that out.
All right.
Ma'am, I have a little add-on question as well. So, given the patrilineal structures and firm patriarchy that the Indian society generally has, so while we might not declare, I mean, it's not going to be easy to declare a feminist foreign policy. What are the essentials we can start off with?
Yeah. Thank you for your question. As you have also rightfully recognized, Shobna, that a feminist foreign policy may not be adopted in India because of various reasons in any near future in its entire form. But neither is any other feminist foreign policy or declared for feminist foreign policy are. also are very comprehensive. What you can do is introduce it with certain elements or certain focus or certain lens of feminist understanding. So, what are the essentials? I know that India, leaning on the more conservative with regard to adoption of or support of international human rights, generally gender equality, women's rights, and all of that. There in India has been a very conservative or leaning on the side of conservative in their support to those issues. So India is not among the countries that goes out and bats for gender rights in all the international fora and discussion. But if we were to assume that there can be a certain move towards adopting certain essential elements, one can start with what is based in the Indian Constitution of equality, and non-discrimination, which is the basis. Non-discrimination based on sex and gender would be some of the essential to start with, because in today's day and age, nobody can argue in India that it is okay to discriminate, why discriminate against women, or it is okay to make, to promote gender inequality, at least on paper. I'm not saying that it's not, that discrimination against women is eliminated, or that society is completely gender equal. It is not. But we do have a constitutional provision that makes it unconstitutional to have that practice. So given that the government is committed to gender equality and non-discrimination on the basis of sex and gender, is an adequate basis for it to go and support and say that we will do the same thing, the same obligations that we have under our constitution, that we will follow that within our foreign policy practices. That would be one of the bases on which we conduct our foreign policy. That would be the basic bare minimum that it can start. And I don't think there could be any argument for the government to not include that, because it is already committed to accept that within the constitutional structure of our country.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I request Abhishu Karkiji to ask the question.
Thank you so much. My question is more from a comparative lens. So when we look at other theories of international relations, other lenses of realism, constructivism, how can we look at it in a collaborative or contrasting sense to feminist foreign policy theory?
I'm sorry, I couldn't. You were very faint. I didn't hear your question well. Can somebody repeat the question? I couldn't hear you.
Am I audible? Is it better now?
You're audible, but very faint.
Okay. I don't know why it is that way, but I'll try to speak a little louder if that
Yes,
helps at all.
that helps.
Okay, thank you. My question is more from a comparative lens. So when we look at other theories of international relations, other lenses of realism, constructivism, and all these other general theories, how can we compare, contrast, collaborate that with the feminist foreign policy theory?
Thank you. Well, I would say that the other theories, there are certain elements of other theories that could be adopted, that could be similar, in terms of its practice, foreign policy practice, in terms of how you interact on a day-to-day basis. Some of those elements of feminist foreign policy could be, adapted, and vice versa. For policies of policy, but when, when one goes onto the policy, there could be certain elements that may prevent, based on the situation on the ground, may prevent, fully implementing it, given what the realities are of that particular of that particular country. And I can only explain that with an example. So if there is a policy of gender equality in of within a feminist foreign policy that includes gender mainstreaming and but contrast that with what is a practice on the ground. Supposing there is a negotiation about development aid to a certain context which has just come out of conflict, and the issue is of justice for women survivors of the conflict in the area in which there is a negotiation of international aid, for example. Now, the question is, what is justice for survivors or women in the conflict situation? Who defines that, and from which perspective? So if we are talking of a gender justice perspective from an international area, or from the countries where there is a commitment to a feminist foreign policy, you would say equal right to the woman who is a survivor there out in the conflict. But the context within which they are operating, they prefer not to go to the conventional access of justice as understood by us, but would more into what is called their traditional justice system, which is more accessible to women, which is more, how do you call it, within the belief systems of the community there, but not necessarily gender just. So then how does one operate in that situation? It is these areas that, other theories of foreign policy then intersect and interact and evolve into what elements is used from each of these theories to address that particular situation. Does the country with the feminist foreign policy then impose their understanding of gender equality over there? Do they therefore then refuse the international aid and assistance that country coming out of conflict desperately needs? And this is not a just an imagined scenario. It is what is happening in out there. This is specific experience of survivors coming out of conflict, and the experience of those negotiating peace and involved in conflict resolution, including the women and survivors of the conflict over there. So these are very complex questions. And I don't believe that there are, I think feminist foreign policy is at and ought to be an overarching goal in terms of, how it, in terms of its policy and vision and all that. But I do not think that any theory can be very dogmatic in its approach. And that is where I think feminist foreign policy can also inherently be flexible or have an elasticity in how it deals with people on ground, and therefore, incorporate elements of other theories. If I have.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay.
Ma'am, there's one more question in the Q&A box. I would request you to type in the answer for that question, since we are a little short of time. Ma'am, can you type in the answer for the last question that is in the Q&A box?
Okay, I missed a representative.
All right. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay, I can do that.
Now I request upon Professor Asha Hans, Founder Director of School of Women's Study at Utkal University, India, to address us on the topic of women's role in post-conflict contexts, a South Asian perspective. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. And hi, everyone. It's good to be with all of you. And I hope that there is some connection in what was said just now by Vahida and what I'm saying. There is a continuity. And to do that, maybe I'll start with what she said a little bit and then go on to not on feminist foreign policy per se, but on feminism itself as to what we understand by it, because there are many people saying different things. In fact, I heard yesterday someone saying that I think it's better not to use the word feminist or feminism because you know the old arguments. So maybe it's I like to share my presentation. I usually don't do presentation, but today I thought I will try one. In fact, this is a photo that of the Kargil war, and it's a real photograph. It was taken of the Beaufort when I visited Kargil. And one of the things the women kept saying that is so frightening. And they said something which is very weird. They said that when the guns go off, we know which is Pakistani gun and we know which is the Indian gun, because the Indian one, we hear one, from the Pakistani side, we hear two because there is an echo. So this kind of, but that was at the height of the conflict that was taking place, and people were really, women were scared, living in bunkers all the time. So, but the first thing that I'd like to say is that I don't think, I personally believe that in the South Asian context, where conflict is concerned, there is no post opri. Since 1947, there is a continuity of a war system. I mean, you can say it's a continuity of a peace system or a war system, but there is no, I cannot say that today India, Pakistan had a war and tomorrow, you know, women's, what their situation is in the post-conflict situation. But what I was saying just now, that should we use the term feminism or is it a Western concept? That is what I was told yesterday, that it is a Western concept. And I think Chanda Talpade's Mahanti's under Westernized goes a little toward that angle. But I also remember the Dalai Lama say that if feminism is about women's rights, then I am a feminist. So, you know, there are two different views about feminism is, and if you are a believer in women's rights, and I say that I'm a feminist, I think I'll go with that rather than say that it's a Western concept. Because in international relations, the women who have written on sex and militarism, on women's rights during war, people like Cynthia Cockburn or Betty Reardon, and all of them, they were Western, but they were good friends. And I think they believed also that what we are talking about feminism, it doesn't have a north-south dichotomy. We can still make it a transnational one. And that is what I'm thinking of, that maybe we should go below, above that. I like Bell Hooks, who's a Black feminist, who defines feminism that it is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation and oppression. But, you know, I'm asking all of you here today, the students who are here, that if you look at it from a conflict or militaristic view, how would you define it? If all of you, some of you, those who would like to define it, I think you could put it in the chat box. It would be a good thing for, I think, even for Vibhuti and me to know what you're thinking. How are you going to define it? For me, I tried this morning something and I wrote that it is a movement for women's equality to end war and upend militarism, and also the end of what we are thinking in terms of ending war, in terms of peace that we are thinking. Because for me, I'm a peace advocate. I teach peace. So for me, conflict is on the other angle. Then in terms of militarism, if you want to define militarism or try to know what militarism is, I think what we are looking at is that it is basically the increase in armaments, including nuclear weapons. Now, one of the things that has become very, very, at least in my own work that I have been looking at, I have seen that the reason why people are looking at militarism in a way that the market comes into place. If the market is in place, that means that the money that you are spending for producing weapons, it goes from the state, it goes from the people to the production of the weapon, whether you do it if the state does it, or you are doing it for importing it, or you are exporting it. In all of that, it still becomes a threat multiplier. Because during any kind of war, if you have seen, many of us have seen war from very, very closely. People's lives and homes are not only devastated, but what we have been studying for the last many years is what happens to social budgets. What happens when India is today the second or third in terms of weapon import. In such conditions, what happens to our social budget? Now we can understand why our education budget, our health budgets are so low, or it is Pakistan, or it is Bangladesh, that you can know a country's quality of living through the budget that it spends on education and health. And if all your money is going towards importing armaments, then I think, like Jayati Ghosh, she's an well-known economist, she said that one ICBM costs equivalent to 340,000 primary schools or 65,000 healthcare centers. If you didn't have that ICBM, this is what you could have got. So national security system, in this kind of militarism, it is embedded. If it is locked into militarism, then we don't look for another kind of security system. I personally believe that if you are looking at national security system, then you're looking at armaments alone. What we as feminists believe that the other system of human security is something that we need to look at, and we should be taking care of to see that it is brought into the feminist circles. In this gender inequality and a militarized culture, because you don't only fight wars on borders. When you have weapons, you have small weapons you buy, then it comes into the state itself, into society, into people. There is a violence created within the state. And this is something that we need to take care of. Now, if beginning with the story of women in post-conflict South Asia, I feel that it is a women's movement to gain gender equality, whether it is Vibhuti or whether it is me. That has been part of the work that we have been doing over the years. And what we see here, at least I see, is the absence of a new paradigms in peace, such as human security. And what you talked today about the facets of feminism, such as feminist foreign policy. So we look at it from both those angles. Then feminism look at it from a conflict situation, writing the in South Asia. I'm sure you have heard of all these women, most of you have. I think Vibhuti and I have known most of them. Kumari Jayawardena, that was one of the first books that was written on feminism and nationalism in the third world that came, which really made a change in our thinking. Malati died very young, And her writings on what she had written on the war zones. She worked with me on some projects on war zones in a Canadian project that we had. And beside her, there are other writers across South Asia. You have Urvashi with The Other Side of Violence. I'm sure most of you have read her work. Nigat Khan, who lives in Karachi, is a Pakistani. She not only runs the Women's Studies Center in Karachi, but she also writes a number of articles that I've seen about that she has written. She's also a partner with me in the Pakistan India People's Forum. And those all who are speaking in this series, whom you have heard and who have talked about what they're writing and what they're doing. My story goes back to 1947. I feel that is where militarism, we need to study the growth of militarism in South Asia, comes from that perspective. This photo is that of partition. I am a child of partition. My family came from Pakistan during the war, and the kind of horrors that they saw, at least my mother never talked of it. The hurt, the depth of anger was so much as to what was done with women. Thousands and thousands were raped on the way. They were abducted. And not only that, the state was, they acted as if it was an anti-feminist move, that you abduct our women, so we want them back. They did never ask the women, do you want to come back? Do you want to come home? Women who had been married, who had children, were abducted and then brought back by the state. So the role that the state plays during a militaristic environment that we have, we need to study that. And this partition insecurity is not only in India and Pakistan, it is also in Bangladesh, which was divided from Pakistan. And the impact specifically on women is very extensive. Now, we need to look at, then if you're looking at wars and post-war violence, what happened once the violence is over, it doesn't end. If my mother went through partition, it didn't end with her crossing over to India. It remained all her life. So women's experiences of armed conflict in South Asia is the kind of experience of violence, the experience of sexual assault that is also not only from outsiders, but also within the home, where domestic violence increases, political violence increases, and people begin to talk that you are a woman and this is the way you act and this is the way you should not act and this is what you have been doing. So these kind of violence continues for over years against them, and it's remained embedded in our culture, it remains embedded in the state and the people who are there. In Bangladesh, for example, when it was divided, when it was born from Pakistan, it was the victims of rape, there were about 70,000 to 100,000 women who were raped. They were given the title of Virangana, that these are the people, a title which would make them, as if they are not only widows, but they are also someone who deals with the conflict in a way that we are giving them a medal, we are giving them a new name. But their children they were the aliens. If you had a child, you were raped by a Pakistani soldier, that child did not become a Bangladeshi right after the division. So that was something right through in all of South Asia, you will see during conflicts, that while women get new names, the children are always the alien. And this is something that we need to study much more. Usually when we study in feminist literature, we study women, but children are something that we need to look at completely because they impact them also. So between India and Pakistan, there have been a number of conflicts where the post-conflict situation of women, whether it was, this is what I was saying, that there is a continuity. You cannot have a post-conflict situation the way we describe it, because from 1947 to partition, we had incessant wars. We have 1965, 71, 99 Kargil. But it's not only that. All over the area, every day is a war on the borders. There are guns being used on the borders. It's not that it's being, we are being told about it. We have wars in the northeast, we've had conflicts, and we've had conflicts Pakistan has had in Balochistan, but the skirmishes continue. And if you look at the agony of women, looking at the children, this is from Balochistan, what happened when a person dies within the family, within the community. So here it is not only my child, it is not my husband, it is also the child of the community, the person who leads the community also. So these are things that we need to look at. In Nepal, the most most of you have heard about the Maoist revolution that was there from till 2006, which had gendered impacts, but it was also not only that men were the soldiers, it was also women who joined the Maoist People's Liberation Army. There were a large number of women who were there. Now, once they joined, they were still exploited within it. In most wars, whether you have seen in Latin America, whether you have seen in Asia, you would see that during wars, the women are usually at the receiving end, and they're exploited by the armed forces themselves within the army and outside the army also. And this is something that they experience. But also the women who were part of the PLA have written about it, how they have been systematically violated by the armed forces, the Nepalese armed forces themselves. Bhutan, you see, is a very quiet state. You don't hear much about it. But Bhutanese government in '88 launched a program which impacted a lot of women who in Nepal, in neighboring Nepal, but the ethnic Nepali group who were then in Bhutan. And this is something that they were not only forced to leave at the end of this program that they had, where they said all of them must become Bhutanese, that they were forced to leave Bhutan and eligible for citizenship without proof of residency. But their children also were not citizens. So many of them left when they did get citizenship, but the children. The most important part of any kind of conflict and post-conflict situation, if you say that there is no conflict in India, because that is what the government said, that we do not have a conflict. The AFSA shows us that the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, what happened to women. You have seen photographs of the Northeast, of women naked, of women being tortured, even in Manipur in the last war, a conflict that is continuing. So that is why I said there is a situation, and both in 2004 and 2023, when AFSA was used and women were they were at the receiving end, their bodies have been used in this nationalistic project, first earlier by the soldiers of the Indian Army, and secondly by the soldiers of and the parties themselves belonging to the state. Now, Radhika Kumaraswamy says that the post-conflict environment is about male power system, where one set of men lose power and the others take over. So there is a continuity of male power during a conflict situation and in a post-conflict situation. And women not in power structures are rarely involved in post-conflict discussion. When a conflict gets over, there's always a chance to get peace, but is sometimes not possible at all. And what Radhika Kumaraswamy said, that these are soft areas, women's rights, and peace has to be inclusive and sustainable, so it cannot be a soft area. So what we need is a paradigm shift from militarism to peace, where if we need to transform our society. And here the women's movement has played an important role, not only now, but also before the war, whether they were the Indians in Lahore and the Pakistanis across the years. Women's movement has played a tremendous role in trying to see that war ends and peace takes over. Among the women some of whom I've known well, some of we have all worked with, I really think that among them, the leaders of the women's movement was Nirmala Deshpande, who not only went to the border and went across to Pakistan so many times, she led us, the movement for peace, and part of the Pakistan India People's Forum. She also, when she died, she asked that her ashes be put in the Indus River and not in India. In the same way, Asma Jahangir was another great activist of Pakistan, a lawyer who had come to India a tremendous number of times to talk about peace, to see that where the governments of both India and Pakistan were concerned, how could we bring them together, we as women. And one of the, in fact, just before Mohini Giri, who was head of the Guild of Service, had called me and said that, Asha, we would like to work on WIPSA again. And Saida Hamid, who is now the chair of the Pakistan India People's Forum and was also part of WIPSA, was one of the breakthroughs that they made when they took women across to Pakistan from India, on a mission of peace. And among the other women, Anish Harun, Nigat, Lalita Ramdas is well known in India, and Kamla Bhasin, of course, who started Sangat, was a tremendous person. In fact, there was so much of linkage here. I remember that one of the things that the Pakistanis had was called the Aurat March on East. Every year they used to have. And the first time that they had, they said, they started a slogan on Azadi. And that Kamala Bhasin took it up later. And of course, it was taken up by the political parties in the last election. But it was something that came out of the Pakistani Women's March. In other South Asian peace activists beside India and Pakistan, Khushi Kabir has been part of Sangat and has worked. She's a Bangladeshi environmentalist, and Shirin Haq, who works on. There are very few people who work on nuclear weapons, and one of them is Salma Hashmi, because that is something that is supposedly dangerous for us to work on, because when we work even on nuclear power, it also means that is linked to anti-nuclear weapon, and that is why many of us have a problem working with this in fact, India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons. I think Pakistan has about 170 or 172. Both of them have nearly equal, around 170. In Nepal, there have been Rita Thapa, Bandana Rana, many of them you might have known. But I have known personally Kumi Samuel, and once we were working on 1325, and she wrote something, she said that 1325 cannot simply make war safer. It needs to address, why does war happen? Why does war continue? It must address the armaments industry, authoritarian and populist administrators, illiberal democracy, violent extremism, the backdrops to wars and conflict. 1325 was the Security Council resolution that came in year 2000 and passed by the Security Council. This was the first Women at Peace Security Council resolution that was passed. And it was due to a Bangladeshi, Anwarul Chowdhury, who brought this to see that it was passed unanimously. 1325, the situation is not that great, but still it continues to be one of the issues that women across Bangladesh, India, and many other countries would like it to see it in progress. Now, in Nepal, where the peace processes were concerned, once the Maoists had given up in 2006, there was negotiations took place between the Maoists. In fact, I was at one of the peace missions that went there, and I remember sitting on the road with a peace activist in Kathmandu, and the government people came down and spoke to us and agreed that they would have some kind of negotiation. But that was 2004. They did not do that for a number of years. And the women were all there out on the streets, thousands of women, and they were calling for peace negotiation. But when the peace came, there were no women on the table. And that is something that we have been asking for, the decision-making power of what women should be included. The Comprehensive Peace Accord, which was signed between the Maoists and the Nepalese, the women ex-combatants whom I talked of earlier also faced a large number of challenges, because in any post-war transition, they have to be included. But whether it was in Sri Lanka when the ethnic war was taking place, or whether it was in Nepal, any women who had taken part in the war, they were completely marginalized. There were so many prejudices against them, and the officials were something that tried to overlook what they had tried to do. It was not a war of their making, but they were participants in it, and that was something that was a black mark. So like this woman says, my only hope is that Nepal will never see a war again. No matter what, nothing is worth a war. So all of us, whether what happened in Hiroshima, in fact, I asked some of my students the other day, I said, do you remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki and what happened? And unfortunately, they did not know what had happened, what was the result of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that is why peace studies become so important to us, and we need to take this forward. Some of the women peace activists who have played a very special role in the armed forces, in the trying to remove the Armed Forces Special Power Act, which has now been diluted, but still exists, was Iram Sharmila. For more than a decade, she was on a fast. And that was something that very few women across the world, she became an icon for the Indians, but across the world, there was very little recognition of Iram Sharmila. In the same way, in the Northeast, this is the photograph that I was telling you, that women in the Northeast who were protesting against conflict, against the army who had raped them. Earlier it was the army, and they started a movement called Stop All Bloodshed. And you can see the woman walk. If you, all those who belong to the Northeast or had been there, you will remember that these turbulent times in Nagaland, in Manipur, and now still going on in Manipur. And this is something that still continues despite the efforts for these women to bring peace within it, whether it was Iroma, whether it was the groups of women, the Naga mothers, who played such an important role in trying to end not only alcoholism, but also to end the use of weapons by men, young men. In fact, if you had been to Nagaland in those years, you would remember the women going out and saying that it is not only the army, but it also our young men we need to protect. In Kashmir, Pravina Ahangar has been leading a struggle to find disappeared persons in 1995. And even now, they still continue their struggle, but it's something, part of their history and part of all wars, that people not only are dead, but they disappear. They are either killed or they are in prison and they never come back home. And these are the people, whether it was Kashmir, a number of them, if you remember, they were in Sri Lanka, where the mothers came forward, and that was one of the first meeting that started with the mothers coming forward and saying that we need to look at our children, where are our children. Sangat was one of the largest feminist network which carries out peace activism against South Asia. So you can see Kamla Basin and Parvina Ahangar, both of them fighting for the rights of women, fighting for the rights of children. And in Maldives and Bhutan, which does not have the direct kind of conflict, Bhutan has with the Nepalese, but Maldives, a new women's movement came into 2012 only by the Maldives government, was not very open to women coming into and protesting against democracy, that democracy comes back. And after every change of government, the women have been forced to move back one step. Now, how are women's peace initiatives in South Asia impacting the region? Amrita Chachi, a major writer in India, says, however, notwithstanding these processes of separation and alienation, what brings these nations together are the intersecting lives and subjectivities of South Asian women. If all the nations are Pakistan against India, Nepal against India, India against Bangladesh, or against Sri Lanka, there are so many divisions among nations. But Amrita says that it was the South Asian women that have put a unifying perspective on self-inflicted cracks within the region's geographies and ideologies. And it was these kind of the movements that they had. The movements are not separate. India did not have one movement alone for itself. The women have crossed borders. Anis Harun has been a number of times. Nigat has been here. We have gone to Lahore and to Karachi or to Dhaka or to, in fact, going to Jaffna. And the only country that I could not get a visa at one time was Sri Lanka, because I was working on Sri Lankan, the war and the refugees who had come into India. So, there are a lot of issues that women have highlighted, and usually in a very quiet and sensitive way, they have reached out across borders. They have reached out to other women. Khushi Kabir working with Kamla, or all of us working across borders. We have, I'm sure, there will be a number of you working across borders also have friends in other nations, in other states. So why not in South Asia? That is something that has been very difficult for us. At the moment, we don't have visas to go to Pakistan unless for a special reason. So if visas become a problem, our goods don't go across the states. In fact, women have been standing on one part of the border, and that is the Wagah border, which we call it a place of peace, where women from Pakistan come over and we meet them. And when we go up north, the women from the Kashmir, which is the other side, which is not part of India, the women from there come over to meet us. You can at one time, I remember standing in Kargil and someone telling me, you look over into the valleys and you can see the houses. That woman had come over from Pakistan into the Indian side, and then the war took place and they were not allowed to go back. She said, I can see my brother from here, but I cannot go there. So these kind of things have happened where people have not met each other for years, even since 1947. My family, who came down to India from 1947, never went back, at least not as a family. As an academic, I could go back, but they never. My mother said did not. It was something that unless there were open borders, she would not be interested in going there. So, it has been the women who have tried to bring together the kind of peace, the environment in a post-conflict situation. And one of the things we did was the UNSCR 1325. I'm sure you have a separate class on it. But as I was a part of it, it was a very difficult time, because for us, India was not interested in UNSCR 1325 and still is not, though it does have a lot of policy on women, peace and security, which it says is part of that, but it will not sign it. Anwar al-Chowdhury has been, Swarna and I had written a book, so he was part of that book on openings of peace. And the UNSCR 1325 did not come from the West. Most women in India also do not want UNSCR 1325, thinking that it is a Western concept because it was headed by Cora Wise and Riordan, but it was promoted by Anil Chowdhury, a Bangladeshi man. And one other thing that UNSCR 1325 does is the national action plans, which Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka have, but we still do not have. This is a women's, many of the things that UNSCR 1325 does is we have been trying to promote it at the local level. Mavic, who's a part of one of the biggest networks on peace, and she's a Filipino, lives in the US. She works in Colombia on the ground using 1325 as something that local women could use. It is to bring about peace in the conflicted situations in the society. We also try to make a national action plan at a national level, but it's still we are way behind, and I think 1325 does not seem to be working at all. This is something from Kargil at the height of the war. And this was something that the women were using computers, they had come to learn, and the peace marker was there. So this is something that I believe that what we as women want peace. That is what post-conflict situation means. For me, it means that. And for many of us peace activists who are living in that kind of situation, feel that this is the aim of what we are doing, whether it's feminist foreign policy or whether it is feminism is not to be frowned upon, not to be looked down upon. Is we believe we have crossed the stage of North-South and come to a transnational kind of, thinking across borders, that is, if we keep borders, then how are we going to ask people not to fight wars? How are we going to ask people not to, use conflict? We ourselves are creating borders. So let us not do that. Let us all look into an issue of a peace structure. Despite the ongoing conflicts, we have so much work to do. And we as women and also the men who have joined us in that struggle, the Pakistan India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy, as men and women. And we work on nuclear weapons. We go across to Pakistan, to Kashmir. I have very close friends in Kashmir. But, we have to understand the agony of women in conflict situations. We have to understand what they undergo and what is to be doing. Thank you, Vibhuti, for allowing me to be here. And I'm sure that there will be, I know that everyone must be tired with 2 lectures, one after another. And that is why I like to keep it light instead of going into the theory and the concept. Maybe that's for another day.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for an inspiring and detailed session and for sharing your expertise and perspectives with us.
Yeah.
I would like to invite our chair, Professor Patel, for her remarks now.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Asha Hans, for such an inspiring, glorious her story of feminist solidarity in South Asia that you gave. That gives us the ray of hope. But I wanted to know that to what extent do transitional justice mechanisms like Judicial Inquiry Commission have incorporated gender perspective in South Asia, and what implications such commissions have on the broader discourse on justice and security.
One of the things I think we have seen across the globe, that we have many conventions, we have many treaties, but despite that, the only thing that seems to be working, unfortunately, is that people have to go to court, whether it's to the ICC, whether it is to our own courts here, but that is the only way where we see justice. If that does not give us justice, like it did not give Mathura, then it is a disaster. But then that is a struggle that we have to still keep going. And that is a struggle that all of us we have to learn how to deal with it. We have to learn and it is not what we think, it is what the women on the grass are thinking, on the grassroots. What are they feeling? What are the women on the border saying? When I went to Kargil to look at the situation, the women said, we don't get food. That is our most priority. A woman gets up at 4 o'clock in the morning. The only thing she has, they grow turnips. So she had that was the only food. So what does that woman do? Can she go to justice, to a convention? Can she go to justice, to one of the, even to the courts? That is something that, we have to think about it. We as feminists know that the only thing that works is solidarity. Whether it's with you, between all of us here today, or whether it is the women in the conflict zone. Come on, what may, whatever the state might think, what the justice system thinks, justice can only come through that solidarity.
And we have seen it works, because during 60s and 70s, when Cuba was completely isolated I remember anybody who went to Latin America, we would just say that please take as much as the airlines allows you to take, whether it is shoes or sugar or clothes. So people to people, even the tourists, we were requesting that when you go there, please carry food. The same thing when people go to Sri Lanka, we say that please carry as much food as possible, for the people. And so I think, but it has limitation, but it's very important. That is the one that retains human essence in us, which is very so important for the
civilization. That is why the UDR is so important, the Universal Declaration of
Human Rights.
That is a feminist thing, that we believe in the dignity and rights of all humans. And that is something that we cannot give up.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Asha ji gave us Asha, that there is, in these difficult times also, we have some hope, and even currently, like the way South Africa has intervened for the solidarity of Palestinian people, and every day feminists are coming out in protest, though the mainstream media doesn't report about it, but we know that what's happening in the ground. I think many questions were to quick. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. I request the participants, they can either raise the hands from the Zoom feature or they can type in the question in the Q&A box. And I request Parvez Babulji to ask his question.
Bangladesh. Please introduce yourself. Parvez ji, please unmute her.
Okay, thank you so much, Asha ji, for your insightful presentation. And it's really, I'd like to mention that you have mentioned the name of Dr. Shirin of Bangladesh, and her organization's name is Nari Pokho. I have been working in Nari Pokho with her, and also with her younger sister, you know probably her name, Nasrin Haq. Nasrin Haq is dead already. Nasrin Haq was my colleague. So we are in Bangladesh working against, violence against women. So there are many success stories. The issue is, for example, in 1952 in Bangladesh, there was Bangla language movement. In 1971, there was independence war. And war, there women are being violated. For example, in 1971, more than 500,000 women have been violated during the war. In 1971 in Bangladesh, during the war between Pakistan and Bangladesh. I mean, East Pakistan and West Pakistan. And all over the world, where there is war, there are women are being violated. And another issue is, there are many success stories of women movements all over the world. Many women, we can mention the names of them, but their success stories are not being perfectly, focused. In the newspapers, in the forums, in the platforms, or in the international seminars, conferences. Globally, it's not is being perfectly focused. So please tell me, Ashadi, how we can focus more the success stories of women movements and how we can stop rapes in any country, in any place of the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Parvez. I think
thank you, ma'am. Yeah.
And I would have nearly the same kind of answer, that not only what I said about solidarity, but women's issues are not that important for the world. We are still not highlighted. The only time they want us, when they want to show that we have a scheme, and this is at the moment we have a Subhadra scheme in Odisha that is meant for women only. We are the recipients. We are never seen as the leaders. We are never seen as people who are in the forefront. If we are in the forefront in movements also, people will tell you that these women are put there by men. If women are standing for election at grassroots, they are called as panchayat patis are there, this kind of, the kind of attitude that we have, the kind of, I think this needs to change. We need to change our thinking. We have been trying it, and I think now you young people have to learn to tell us also what is it that we are not doing right, that we still do not. What should we do right to go forward? Because you are the ones who will lead us. We have tried as much as we can. But at the same time, I would say that, feminism and the attitude that is there is not only a male attitude. It is an attitude which comes from society, the way society treats us. So when people blame only men or blame women, I think we need to look at from the community point of view. How can we move the community to go forward? What is there, whether it's even your village, what do you do? What happened when Bangladesh is looking after so many Rohingyas? Isn't that something that is extraordinary? That the refugees who are there are being looked after by the Bangladeshis, and I'm sure it's not only the government or donors who support Rohingyas. So, it is the women there on who are the leaders. If you look at any refugee movement, across the globe, you will see that 70% of them are women and children. And it is they who lead. It is they who will tell you that what is the need of. I think we need to listen. The society has lost its, the listening power. Everyone wants to only talk. I am the leader. I'm the minister. We need to also listen. I think we need to tell our leaders also, please listen much more than we are. And I think you've got social media, so that's in your favor because that is something that people are listening to, even the ministers. If you put also against a local chairperson of a municipality and you put something that he or she does not like, things are okay. So I think we need to use new kind of tools, new ways of doing things. Vibhuti, you want to add to this?
I think, I just want to add that we can learn from Colombian feminist movement where 1,000 women, they signed the petition demanding end of war, no? And also the pacifist feminist policy. So I think there are such glorious examples and they give us hope, and it also gives us capacity, confidence that we can also do the same, no? So the way like Nirmala Deshpande could walk from Delhi to Karachi and Asma Jahangiri could walk from Karachi to Delhi way back some 30 years back, I think it is possible for the citizens also to take the message of people.
I think someone should start, and someone should be a catalyst or message maker, and someone should, place an example, create example so that others can follow him or her, right?
Yeah.
Someone should start, at least, in any country, yes. So people can follow him.
No, and also when the Indian peacekeeping forces, they violated women in Jaffna, we all went there. I remember personally going to Jaffna, and I know that I was taunted that you have come, the big brother has come and all that. I could understand their pain and their cynicism about any Indian going to those difficult, to those war-torn places. But I think, and after that we wrote also, no, to the Prime Minister, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, that this is what we have seen. So even couldn't push Paura the day it happened. We know that press club, we all went from Bombay to Delhi to attend the press conference, and they say, and also the investigation committee with the feminists had organized and gave the report of what the Indian army has done. And after they did not acknowledge what feminists said, but at least after that, the policy for this kind of sending the army, they started using sending women. So in Liberia, they sent women, and we got accolades because these women soldiers were so kind, caring. They were counseling, they were procuring food for them. They were, if the children and women were scared because of attack by the predators and all, they would accompany them to the school or to the soup kitchens. And such nice feedback we got, and there is so much good feeling about Indians in Liberia, no? So
one of the generals after the IPKF told me, when I asked him that why did the Indian soldiers behave the way they did, and he said they were frustrated. You know, the kind of answer that they give is so insensitive that, but you know, it's that's part of the world. We have to.
Yeah, no, but what happens, the mainstream politicians don't acknowledge what people say. But at the same time, they also know that this kind of bad feelings that the communities have, or the internationally also, it's so damaging the way Indian peacekeeping forces has behaved. It was like known. They at least changed their policy when it came to sending the soldiers or any kind of a relief at the time of. So that can be seen as a what you call one step ahead, no? Because of the feminists were the only ones who were challenging jingoism and who were talking about something wrong, because that the answer, 2-line answer I got from Prime Minister's office was that we acknowledge your statement, but we don't accept it because Indian army is very chivalrous, and taking any action against them would demoralize the Indian army, and it would create a threat to the sovereignty of the country. That was the answer we received.
Yeah, Vibhuti, I would like to add a few sentences. I mean, especially the developing countries, including Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and any other countries. I mean, the policies should be bottom up policies, okay, not the up to bottom. I mean, bottom up policies, especially, for example, the marginalized women, grassroots level women, they are out of opportunities of decision making. For example, in the village level, the women are always, in the backward, okay? They are not in front and they cannot talk, they cannot decide, they cannot take any decision. So that is why there are many backwards for the women in the village level, grassroots level or remote areas, especially in Bangladesh, for example. So that is why the policies must be bottom-up policy from the bottom, from the grassroots level, and the uh, family should be women friendly, society should be women friendly, community should be women friendly, country should be women friendly, and the global, the world should be women friendly always. And that should be the opportunities for this feminist, foreign policy to implement, and to start. It's my view, right?
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much.
Questions?
Thank you so much. Since there are no more questions, I request Vibhuti ma'am to continue with the closing remarks.
Yeah, today I think we had a very valuable presentations, both by Dr. Vahida, who gave a cross-country comparison of feminist foreign policy, the strengths and weaknesses of this of the whole balance sheet that she provided of the countries, which are 16 countries which have adopted feminist foreign policy, but there are quite so many incongruence and so many gaps. The presentation by Professor Asha Hans was very, very important because it also gave us a hope that we are currently in the midst of so much of jingoistic talks, that are going on in globally also. In the election results of so many countries have shown a very macho, hyper-nationalist kind of forces which have come to power. And it is in this context that the question of peace and conflict resolution gains very great importance. And contemporary armed conflicts in South Asia, they have also blurred the boundary between local and global. I think as Dr. Asha brought it out very effectively by giving example of Kargil, that woman from Pakistan stuck in India could see her brother but could not go there. So what is local, what is global? The same thing about India, the India and Bangladesh's relationship. And plus, culturally also, we are so this thing we're so close in South Asia. So many of the families in India have their relatives in Pakistan or Bangladesh, and vice versa. But still, for years they haven't met, and they are longing to be. So civilians, and whenever you meet any civilian or a common citizen of all these countries, there is so much of camaraderie, warmth, care, and concern. But when it comes to the states, the nation states and the leaders, you see so much of hostility, which is constructed, and the jingoism reigns supreme. As against that, the women's movement in all these countries have come together. Asha ji gave us example of Sangat, which has done a pioneering work. So women's lived experiences in different regions, for example, the question of what we have seen, that in Afghanistan, this jingoism and hyper-nationalism has resulted in a segregation of women from the public life. We have seen the loss of educational opportunity with the girls in Afghanistan, they can study only up to 6th standard. We have also seen adverse sex ratios. A recent study of our TIS student have also shown that because of constant attack on women's bodily integrity, there are so many families are resorting to either female infanticide or use of technology to eliminate female fetus. So this wide range of socio-cultural implications that you have whenever there is conflict and this kind of insecurity of life. How is women's agency constituted and reconstituted during and after conflict. I think that has come out very well in today's presentation. How does the political masculinity impinge on women's rights and the agency in South Asia? That also now we have experienced the whole macho culture. And the earlier, our expert also said that when Pakistan was talking about attacking India, the Indian leaders, they said, "Humne chudiyan nahi pehen rakhi," so we are not wearing bangles. No, so this kind of culture of jingoism that needs to be combated by the citizens. And how does it impinge power and security? How does militarization and also demilitarization impinge on the understanding of conflict and post-conflict? These are some of the mind-boggling questions that we are experiencing in the context of war, Israel and Gaza war, or Ukraine and Russia's war happening in so many African countries, and in South Asia also. It is in a constant insecurity among the citizens, especially even we are not allowed to even organize meetings. Like if the only place we can have South Asian conferences is in Kathmandu, because all other countries would have a problem of visa. So the states are acting in a certain fashion, and we as citizens, or so many non-state players, they also have to come out with various strategies. And I think Asha ji told us very, very important suggestion that we can use social media. It has a power of reaching out, because mainstream media is totally controlled by the global barons, and who are only concerned about the neoliberal accumulation and using war, because all the countries which are talking of feminist foreign policy, their prosperity comes from military weapons they are selling to the countries which are fighting. So I think that politics now, again, earlier we had in the 50s and 60s, we had a campaign against nuclear disarmament. Now nobody's talking about it. Every country is talking about, in the name of securitization, they are asking, increasing the budget of this. We are doing gender responsive budgeting. Anytime there is a leftover fund in because gender budgeting, so many states don't even know how to, and they don't know the schemes, and they don't send proposal. Any leftover money you have by the October, Defense Ministry is always ready to take over the remaining fund. And here Dr. Hans also quoted Dr. Jayashree Jayati Ghosh's thing, that if one ballistic missiles can take away the budget of 35,000 schools or 6,400 health centers, that itself shows that now we can't remain just complacent with our own personal security in a gated community. We all have to stick out our neck. We all have to take stand. We have to take sides. Where are we in terms of the social policies, in terms of legislation, in terms of diplomatic policies, in terms of relation? Because at globalization, we are taking all advantages of globalization. But when it comes to using this opportunity for the global solidarity, whether it is the migrant people from the whole issue of migration was also brought out so well. What is happening to the African migrants? What is happening to Mexican migrants? How are the rich countries using them as instruments of cheapest labor, at the same time not giving them any citizenship right? All these issues we need to take stand, and I think that is the aim of this course. And you all, I know that you are a very proactive on all these issues. You work for the civil society organizations and the state also. Some of you are also in the government jobs in several countries in Asia, Africa, and all English-speaking countries. There you are there. So I think all of us, we can put our heads together and come up with an alternative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for ending it on such a positive note. With this, I proceed with the formal vote of thanks as we conclude the day 7 session of Feminist Foreign Policy Fellowship, an online international winter school program, a 3-month immersive online introductory leadership certificate training fellowship program. I, Fizam Hajan, visiting researcher at IMPRI, would like to express my gratitude on behalf of the Asia Foundation, New Delhi, IMPRI, Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies, and IMPRI Gender Impact Studies Center, New Delhi. I would like to thank our chair, Professor Vibhuti Patel, and experts for today, Ms. Vahida Nainar and Professor Asha Hans, for taking out their valuable time and for their thought-provoking insights on the topic. We would like to thank our participants for raising pertinent questions and contributing to the thoughtful dialogue that is essential for this fellowship. And we look forward to seeing you all on December 6th for the next session. Thank you all for your engagement today. We hope that this fellowship will be a transformative and enriching experience for all of you. Have a great day.
Thank you, Fizza, for moderating the session so well.
Thank you so much, Priyanka.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay.
Presentation.